Ever been in the middle of a project and suddenly realize, hey, wait a minute, where did that stitch go? Today I'm sharing some sneaky ways your stitches might be disappearing without you even noticing, and how to stop it from happening again. Here's one that is more of a logical one. It's really obvious, but I still want to mention it because it happens all the time. And it's simply when you're creating your starting chain, it's really easy to miscalculate those chains. So a really easy fix to this is to simply add stitch markers after every 10th chain. And then you can just count those stitch markers, which is a lot easier and more accurate than chain by chain. Another great option is to do a chainless foundation, and I'll go ahead and link to a tutorial here, but even with that you're still having to count those stitches. So again, I would recommend just adding a stitch marker after every 10th stitch. Another sneaky way when you're working your chain is your chains can literally disappear on you as you're working that first row. And that's because you're filling those chains with a lot of stitches, which is stretching out the chain that you're working in. So as you're working that first row, be sure to always stretch out your yarn to pull that chain back into place. Another thing that you can do is to work into the back stitch of the chain instead. You notice the little bump on the back here? If you work your stitches into there, it is less likely to stretch out as much as when you're working into the front of the chain. That back bump is a little bit tighter to work into, but if you get into the habit of using a larger hook for that starting chain, those back bumps are a lot easier to work into with the hook that you're going to use for the rest of the project. And although you're still stretching out the yarn, those bumps in the back are a lot easier to find. The beginning and end of a row is notorious for being the area where you lose or gain stitches, and mainly because of the turning chain. I recently did a segment all about this, so I'm going to go ahead and add here because it's so important. It all has to do with that turning chain and getting confused about where those stitches are that you need to work into. Remember, turning chains correspond with the height of a stitch, and they're typically used just to give you some wiggle room to make that very first stitch. So let's say, for example, you're working your foundation chain, and it tells you to do a double crochet into the 4th chain from the hook. And you'll have something that looks like this, and this is where things can get really confusing. Does this count as a stitch or not? And remember, the pattern is going to tell you. But the biggest tip that I can give you, regardless of the answer, is work with a stitch marker. Let's say, for example, that the pattern says that the chain on the side does not count as a stitch. Then you know that this first double crochet that you made does. So place a stitch marker into the top of that stitch. This is so important because when you finish this row and then you come back to work into this stitch, it can be really hard to see where to place your last stitch. Look how easy it would be to add an extra stitch here. But with this stitch marker, I'm fully aware that that is my very last stitch. I don't have to remember or wonder if I need to do an extra stitch in this turning chain. Now, on the other hand, if the pattern says that it does count as a stitch, find the top of the stitch that you made and then add a stitch marker into the chain right next to it. Now you can be fully confident that when you come back around to work those stitches, you'll know exactly where to place your stitch. Continuing on with that, where do you put your stitch after you've done a turning chain in subsequent rows? Let's say, for example, your pattern says to do a chain 2 and turn and work your first double crochet into the first stitch. Where is the first stitch? Is it these chains or the first stitch from below? So just so you can see it clearly, I'm going to put a stitch marker into the very last stitch that I made. And just following a pattern is telling me to do a chain 2 and turn. And now I can clearly see where the very first stitch is that I need to work into, not the chains. If you do something like that, again, your stitch marker is your best friend. It can get very confusing, so be sure to add a stitch marker so you don't accidentally think that chain 2 that helped you get to the height of the double counts as a stitch. Even today, after crocheting for over 20 years, I still use stitch markers because with my old lady brain, it can be really easy for me to forget if that's a stitch or not. And that is the biggest way that you're going to get those uneven waves on the sides because you're accidentally adding and taking away stitches. So if you just take the time to pop a stitch marker in there, your sides are going to be so accurate, beautiful, and straight. Another really sneaky way is when you're working in the round. Let's say when you're working on a granny square, for example. The easiest way to lose a stitch is in those corners. And that happens because these stitches that you're making go over the stitch that you made in the previous round. So for example, with this solid granny square, after my corner, I was supposed to do 3 double crochets, 1 in each of these doubles, and I only did 2. And that's because I was working quickly and I just glossed right over the fact that I'd worked over the top of that stitch. So a really good rule of thumb, something to remember, is the top of the stitch, if you're right-handed, leans to the right and looks similar to the letter P, or slightly to the left if you're left-handed, giving the shape of a letter Q. So for this double crochet, slightly to the right is my stitch. And after I finish that corner, that stitch is really hard to see, right? So just pull it back and then you'll be able to see the stitch again. And the same goes for when you're coming to a corner. Sometimes we think we need to go into the top of the stitch right here, where in fact that's really part of the chain that you made in the corner. Remember again, your stitch is always to the right if you're right-handed and left if you're left-handed. And a key point to remember here is it's in the reverse when you're working on the back of your work. The back of your stitches will look something like this, which actually makes it easier to see where to place your stitch. It's almost like they're right on top of the stitch when you're on the back side. But if you flip back over onto the front, you'll see again the letter P. A beautiful way to end a round is to do the seamless join. This is an area that you can easily lose your stitch count. For the seamless join, instead of doing a slip stitch, after you've completed your last stitch, snip your yarn and then pull the loop out. Now to make a seamless join, you want to take your tail and thread it through the top of that very first true stitch that you made, because you want to go through that V shape. You can do this with a tapestry needle or you can do it with your crochet hook. Just go from behind and pull your yarn through. And coming back to the very last stitch that you made, go into the back loop only and pull the yarn through there. And you've created a beautiful seam. However, this is where it gets tricky. If you're not careful when you go to weave in this end, if you pull too tight, away it goes. So you need to be very gentle with this technique. Let me show you that again. You can actually pull this yarn through whichever side you like. It's going to give a slightly different look. But if you go this way through, just be sure to do the back loop only on the other side. You might prefer this way because then the tail is in the back and then you can weave it in easily. But again, as you're weaving it into the back, don't pull too tightly on it or it will disappear on you. So be very delicate with it. What I like to do is just find somewhere gently make a little knot. Good, it's still there. And then weave in as normal. So those are all the ones that I can think of right now. Are there any sneaky areas that you've come across that you easily lose a stitch? Be sure to let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed that segment about the turning chain, I think you'll really enjoy this video coming up next, where I talk about the 3 most common questions that I get in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.